So in our communities, we're noticing that discrimination, especially anti-Black racism, playing a role in our mental health. Um, I wanted to open it up first to Meghan about how these barriers exist in accessing these mental health support services.
So just so I make sure that I understand the question, because I can see a couple angles that this could be taken down. It's the role that discrimination has in the access to mental health support, or in the access to being mentally healthy as individuals. I see kind of either or. So I'll start with maybe just being mentally healthy. So discrimination, I mean, when we think about mental health, there's the thought immediately of mental illness, but we're talking about being mentally healthy, thriving versus surviving. To me, is what that speaks to. When our nervous system is in a place that is healthy, when our organs are functioning right, and our mind is in a healthy state, our emotional regulation, our ability to be responsive versus reactive from that survival point. And when you think about racism and discrimination overall, it's traumatizing to constantly see, hear, and also feel that you are an other, that you don't belong, that there is a mainstream or a white-centered view of normal, and it's our innate need to feel belonging and connection. And when we're trying to fit into something that isn't made for us to belong in, or to feel a real sense of belonging, more than just our self-esteem, because that can be fleeting, but talking about that real deep sense of belonging, that those experiences can be traumatizing over periods of time. And then you think about it, I always use the analogy of like laundry. If I leave me and my daughter's laundry for like 3 weeks, I'm gonna have like 26 loads of laundry, right? And so when we have racism that we're in, discrimination that we're experiencing every day through either microaggressions or just the more covert versus the overt, like through the media, through body images, that type of stuff, right? We also have all the racism that we've experienced in the past, so it kind of piles up. So if we're not accessing mental health tools that support us to unpack those things every day, like it's got to be a regular thing, and recognizing that it's a regular thing, then ultimately what's going to happen is going to pile up like those 26 loads of laundry, right, of mental and emotional, physical. And there is now a lot of science showing the connection between, I know Kofi can talk more to this with Reiki, but the connection between the mind and the body. So the emotional tags that our body keeps in either our chakras or just in general in our body from the traumatic experiences of insidious and continuous racism. So that would be the first way. The second way, I will leave that for somebody else. EL did a whole presentation on that, so maybe the barriers piece could be an opportunity for him to elaborate on as well.
Meghan, I really appreciate how you laid that out, and you really spoke to the different ways that racial trauma shows up around us and in our bodies. I think sometimes it's assumed that in order to feel the impacts of racial trauma, it has to happen directly to you. But the reality of it is there's intergenerational trauma. There's also that vicarious trauma that you're speaking to when we're watching things happen on the news, we're consuming it through our social media. And then of course there's the traumas that we experience in ourselves. And it all piles up, and it does have an impact on our bodies. I think I'm going to throw it over to Kofi, if that's all right. And maybe Kofi, you can speak to a little bit of what that looks like in our bodies, and how discrimination, anti-Black racism in and of itself is a barrier to accessing some of these mental health supports.
Absolutely. So, I mean, that's a great question, and often not necessarily discussed or focused on. So we talk about often in some of what I practice during, within traditional Chinese medicine, we talk about the 5 organ systems and the connections between emotional identifications and how they actually show up in our bodies. So, that being said, especially if you're not vocalizing some of the challenges that are happening, right? The emotions that are tied to those scenarios are extremely stressful, and what happens is they have signatures within the body. So individuals that are going through scenarios that are connected to anxiety, high stress, etc., we tend to find ways, like in terms of the discussion I had in terms of substances, to kind of balance those challenges, because without having someone to talk to, without sharing them externally, they're internally stored. And then we start to identify with that stress and try to find ways to address it, but energetically it's already had an impact, right? So high stress situations lead to increased blood pressure. We already have issues of that in our community, and we're also not recognizing some of the aspects that have been passed down through generations. So a lot of folks don't realize that, the high blood pressure that your grandfather had, or your father had, etc., also can, affect you within your life. And if you're utilizing substances, alcohol, etc., to mask some of the issues that are happening mentally, it's also showing up energetically in your body already, right? You're predisposed to some of those issues. So now you're supposed to be even more on top of ensuring that those substances are not in excess or not affecting you in such a way. So back to your question, we need to be mindful. It's almost as though, I always like to say that, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? Being proactive around ensuring that you're receiving the right intake of nourishment within your body as well, eating the proper foods, drinking water, especially if you're utilizing substances. So the second part of your question, I kind of missed. The second part you asked.
Thank you, Kofi, for sharing that. That's incredibly important. And that relationship that we have with the outside world and what we're putting in is just as important. The second part of that question is how does this discrimination and anti-Black racism serve as a barrier to actually accessing some of the mental health supports that we have?
Yeah, so I mean, it's multifaceted, simply because even before the external challenges are happening, I mentioned in my presentation that traditionally we had ways of dealing with things that were affecting our bodies, right? And we usually would use more traditional means. Now, if you're uncomfortable with going into institutions, that's one thing. If you feel like there's a barrier between you and connecting to said services in your community because the staff doesn't look like you, they don't necessarily understand your background or where you're coming from, you already don't feel welcome going into that environment. And if you didn't necessarily see your parents accessing such resources, therapy is a great example of that, right? Most individuals coming from our community did not grow up with parents going to psychiatrists and sitting down and having conversations to navigate their issues. So as a result, it's not a thing that you culturally identify with. So you usually find other ways to address your issues. You talk to your peers, talk to friends, you may talk to close family members, but it usually doesn't go beyond that from a professional standpoint until there's a real serious problem, right? So until somebody has some form of a breakdown, some form of physical and or mental health issue, and then let's say a doctor has to get involved, or they're called to, have to go to the emergency, then they start to have those assessments and start to find out what's really happening. But prior to that, and simply because you don't have a cultural identification with going to these institutions. And I've heard a lot of young people that, if you reference these centers or what have you to go for help, it's not something that they're even open to, simply because there's no cultural identification. They haven't seen that in their family. It's not something that they're used to or their peers doing. And on the flip side, there are scenarios where there's a lot of people in our community doing amazing work. It's just that sometimes they're overtaxed, right? Because a lot of these young people are going to them for support, right, in other circumstances where the relationship has been built. And it's usually like through a school institution or something of that nature. So yeah, definitely the barriers are multifaceted, but one of the pieces is just creating warm and welcoming environments, for individuals from our community that are going for those services, and being able to speak their language. There's a lot of that unfortunately not happening and the statistics to back that are available, but most people are not aware of that. So it's overlooked.
Yeah, you're right, Kofi. It is multifaceted, and you touched on so many of those key points that actually can turn people away from these services. A huge one that I'm hearing you talk about is that lack of safety, and that connection with some of the healthcare providers who might not be culturally aware or informed about, you know, some of what looks like mental health supports for the ACB community, but is often overlooked in the clinical and medical setting. Another huge one that you mentioned is having that relationship already built and seeking that support from someone that you really trust. To build off of that, I'd like to invite Tracy to share a little bit about you know, your perspective on this as someone who works within the cultural and religious community in the mental health and angling it from a mental health perspective. So to rephrase the question, how does discrimination and anti-Black racism play a role in some of the barriers that show up in accessing some of these mental health supports?
Okay, so very good question, and some really good answer and insight already. But from a perspective being on the faith-based, or seeing what I see through the faith-based community, is that we know that about 80% of our Black, African American or Black American Caribbean are more likely to seek, I think it was 82% are more likely to seek out faith-based support before they seek out medical or more professional support. So the first place or where they're most comfortable, and Kofi just touched on that, it's representation. It's where they feel safe, it's identification, this is family, this is home. So they're more likely to go there are the first point of seeking help. And some of the problem with that is that some places are equipped, but some clergies are not well equipped to deal with certain situation. And if they're not well trained and taught to outsource to the professional, to the Meghan, to the, outsource some of those situation, it can be compounded. And the stigma that we know that there's a lot of shame around just the shame, not only the individual that's experiencing the mental illness, but the family. So the individual is the shame, and then the family is the shame because the individual, it's such an extended thing. And because of the shame and the stigma around that, and whatever other beliefs that might be compounded with that, because we know the Black culture is a large culture. I don't like to put everybody under the same banner. We're so multifaceted, and we have different ways of belief. It makes it difficult to sometimes seek out help. So some of those are our own internal barriers based on how, culture, how we were raised. I'm from Jamaica, we have some stuff too. So, and some of it are external, that's outside. So it can, and we don't talk about things. So these are, as I think was Kofi and Meghan said, we keep things in and it stays, and our body register, our body keeps record of all these constant daily attack, and, whether we feel it or not, but the body's keeping score, and eventually you will see that turn up and oftentimes show up in anxiety, panic attack, or some form of severe depression.
Yeah, and Tracy, as you reflect back to some of what Kofi and Meghan were sharing, you mentioned the body keeps score, and throughout their piece, I was thinking about the book, The Body Keeps Score, and actually was mentioned in the chat. So that's a great book. Just as a side point, if everyone wants to take a look at it, it's a great read. But Tracy, you're also speaking to some really important and key parts of this conversation, which is who's at the front line when our community members are experiencing some of that mental health challenges. It's our faith leaders, it's the community that we trust and already have that connection with. So correct me if I'm wrong, Tracy, but I'm hearing you say that it might be room for integration in having wellness and mental health experts mixing in with the faith community in some capacity to either train or offer some of that support. Or am I hearing you right?
Totally. I think if we're going to move this conversation forward, especially with the Black culture, we need to involve the faith-based community, because that's who they trust. That's who they looked at. As I said, over 80% survey that was done. This was 2009 survey that was done. It said that they would first go to their faith, their pastor or priest or clergy, to let them know what's going on. So I think there's room for both, and I think both need to be integrated. I'm from the belief that you pray and you get the help that you need to get, I lay hand and pray on you, and then you need to go to the doctor to get help. So I think there's room for both, and it's something that we do encourage. A holistic approach is not just, the body, but mindfulness and how you care for yourself, spiritually, emotionally, mentally. So it will work better if they all come together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tracy, you're speaking to that, self-care, community care, and spiritual care. So important, and you're right. Holistically is the way that we would love to have for this to work. I'd like to pose this same question to EL, and EL, I'd love to hear your perspective on this. I can pose the question again. We're noticing that there's a lot of anti-Black racism in our communities. And how does this anti-Black racism serve as a barrier to accessing these mental health supports?
Well, thanks for the question. And I think everyone before me has really touched on some key points, and they've touched on the many different layers that are involved. I think, I'm just going to kind of weave in and out of everybody else's answer, but like Kofi was saying, there has to be many areas in a holistic approach and a holistic type of idea of how we're going to tackle these things. Like he said, we don't identify often with the professionals that could help us in the clinical world. The Meghans, the Kofis, the Tracys, like these are people who we're not used to seeing our parents or our relatives relying on. And Tracy mentioned that, faith was a big thing, but we have to consider everybody, because it is the personal support, the social support, the community resources. It's the village that raises that child or that supports that family. And we have to, my moms and pops, they're in their 70s. So this access to such information, let alone services, wasn't available. But when we know better, we do better. There's a lot of things that have evolved over time, and they say, okay, well, moving forward, this probably wasn't something that was a big piece of my community, but it is helpful. And this is something that I can use at least a smidgen of to help me with my overall wellness. Like maybe we have to dedicate more time to meditation. Like me and my brother-in-law, we're now doing some type of meditation, but stretching per night just to help, just for 30 minutes. We're just doing this together just to try something new for our bodies. And then that calms our minds and our souls. And to go to somebody that you don't identify, and it might be new, but you got to ask that question too. Well, what's been tried hasn't been that helpful, or it needs more things. Like we need more to this equation to help us understand what's going on with our bodies and how to treat it. And I think somebody else, they talked about actively, this has to be day to day. This has to be week to week to know that what I'm going through is when we're looking at anti-Black racism, this is our life. Like you can't believe in racism and not believe in mental health, because the racism affects us in such ways. It affects us with our we feel isolated, we feel shame, we feel guilty, we feel frustrated, we feel outcast from society. So if you're gonna say that there's racism everywhere and it affects me in these ways, then you have to believe in how it affects your mental health. And then what do we do moving forward to support that? Like they go hand in hand. Racism and mental health, like they impact us on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, you're speaking to that relationship between the two and how you have to consider them as a unit, because it does impact our mental health.